Dan, you spent some time in Iraq and witnessed the aftermath of some of the terror that Soleimani and his militia exercised even among children. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, back in 2015, I was over there reporting on ISIS 1 year after they had launched sort of their initial rampage across northern Iraq. And we talked to just scores of refugees because they were everywhere. There were refugee camps, IDP camps just all over the country, hundreds of thousands of people. So we heard all kinds of horrific stories about the things that ISIS did. But honestly, the one that stayed seared in my mind was when we met a father of a young son who was in an IDP camp outside of Erbil, and he was saying, "Yeah, we got run out of our town by ISIS, but the real what you're seeing with my son here, he was just obviously traumatized, staring at the ceiling, really didn't talk much at all." He said that they were brutalized by Shia militias who were under the control of Soleimani. These are the type of brute force that they use to keep people in line. And they actually took drills and drilled holes in his son's leg, who was 4 at the time. And, in order to intimidate and get this father to do whatever they wanted him to do, his wife was also killed in this attack, and he was burned. He showed me he had burns all over his body, like severe burns. So this is the type of evil that Soleimani and his henchmen would regularly engage in to keep people in line and otherwise intimidate, divide and cause fear throughout Iran and Iraq and other areas that he operated.
And I understand Soleimani's forces were also responsible for the deaths of thousands of American soldiers. Is that correct?
Yeah, back in around 2004 during the Iraq and Afghanistan war, he was the one kind of leading the charge in putting the roadside bombs. And we know our intelligence could figure it was from them because they were very highly sophisticated bombs. These weren't like makeshift IEDs that we later saw from Al Qaeda and putting those on the side of the roads. These were sophisticated bombs, so they could trace them back to Iran. And so it was Soleimani who was doing this, and it ended up killing hundreds and wounding thousands of American soldiers through his actions. So American blood is definitely on his hands.
Let's talk big picture now. What do Americans need to understand about the Iranian forces and their mission in the world?
Yeah, well, what's really interesting is, and I've seen General Petraeus said this as well, that the death of Soleimani was actually bigger, arguably, than Osama bin Laden. And that's because imagine the same kind of evil as Osama bin Laden, except you have the backing of an official government. And so, essentially what Soleimani did was he would go around and he'd work with all these proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, all these terrorist organizations, these militias that he'd create in Iraq and in his own country in Iran and elsewhere. And so he would just go around, and he even worked with America at times, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so, we've done those sorts of relationships in the past, and we did it with Soleimani, but then he turned around and when it was convenient for him, killed American troops. So this guy is just a terrorist, which he was labeled by the United States and by Canada and others. And his Quds force were labeled terrorists, and because that's what they were doing, and that's what he was leading up around the world. And he traveled. I mean, this is how arrogant he was. He, confident that nobody would do anything to him. He would travel. That's how we found him. It wasn't like that. It was like a big operation and secret mission to find him. He was just, hey, he was running around like Frank Sinatra and, out in the open and lapping up his little fame that he had amongst his fans. And so Trump was just, had enough in him to make the call.
Media and celebrities in Hollywood are speaking out against that action, and we understand the great political divide between them and President Trump. Why are they almost siding with Iran in this case? That's what it seems like.
Yeah, it's tough to say what their motives are, but you do see it in the media. There were headlines in the New York Times recently, and often in others, calling him a revered leader, saying this would be like, killing Pompeo from another country doing that to us, and just all these things. And you just have to think it boils down to perhaps politics, because they just don't like the president. And so they have to find a reason to criticize this action. And there are legitimate concerns to say what will happen, the escalation, is it worth it? But it's really hard to argue that this man deserved what he got.
Back to your story and experience, how did it influence you personally?
You know, this one really stuck with me. I mean, seeing people in such need and who have been through such trauma. We saw another little girl whose family was, executed in front of her by ISIS. So that trip really changed my life because it put real faces to these headlines that we see, and and so it's easy to play politics when you see somebody like Soleimani, and it's his fate was met by Trump. So of course Trump's going to launch controversy almost on anything he does. But to me, it's not very difficult for me to celebrate the fact that this guy is gone. I mean, I'm not happy that anyone would die, but this guy, I wish he would have lived a different life and followed Christ and done things for peace. But instead, he chose a life of war and violence. And so, seeing what I saw, I mean, I can just say that I'm glad he's gone.
All right, Dan Andros with FaithWire. Thank you for your firsthand perspective, Dan. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.